Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Almost 1 year after the death of George Floyd with a police knee on his neck, is there any hope that this constantly replaying dynamic will ever change? Let's get to the bottom line. George Floyd's death at the hands of Minneapolis police almost 1 year ago sparked massive demonstrations and forced Americans from all backgrounds to wonder about their police officers' attitudes towards black Americans. Now the nation braces for a verdict in the trial of Derek Chauvin. He was the officer who kept his knee on Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes during his arrest. But the problem sadly hasn't ended with the death of George Floyd. Not far from where he died, a policewoman killed 20-year-old Dante Wright during a traffic stop just 2 weeks ago. Social justice activists say the list of killings at the hands of police just keeps getting longer, and radical change is needed in the United States. Some argue that these are nothing but modern-day black lynchings by other means. But as the movement to, quote, defund the police and send money to other social support needs loses traction, what fixes are really out there? Today, we're talking to Nana Gyamfi, the president of the National Conference of Black Lawyers, which launched an international commission of inquiry on systemic racist police violence against people of African descent in the United States, and is about to release those findings next week. And Professor James Forman, Jr., who teaches law at Yale University and is the author of the book Locking Up Our Own: Crime and Punishment in Black America. Thanks to both of you for joining us today, and these are obviously tense times. Nana, I know your report is about to come out, but we also have a trial going on and a verdict expected in the coming day or days with Derek Chauvin. And as we produce this show, I'm very aware that 3 black people on average in the United States will die in the next 24 hours as a result of police actions. Can you frame for us what the stakes are in the Chauvin trial and its outcome right now?
Well, the stakes are high, as you know. The stakes are high in many ways. We're looking at how is the jury going to make its decision? What are they going to be talking about? What are they going to be thinking about? How are they taking all the information that's been provided? And obviously, across the country and really across the world, people are waiting to see whether or not this verdict is a reflection of things to come. I think that when we look at this as National Conference of Black Lawyers, we look at this as something that is systemic. This police violence is not just about Derek Chauvin. And so regardless of the verdict, we've been doing this work for the past 50 years, addressing systemic police violence, looking fundamentally at how this affects Black liberation and human rights. And we know that it's not just about one cop, it's not just about one police department or one city, that this is systemic violence and anti-Black violence that needs to be addressed at its core. And the goal of our commission of inquiry and of this report is to help folks to see how that can happen. What are the findings that this international commission made? What are the recommendations? And to bring this issue of police violence in the United States against Black people to the international arena, as families and organizations attempted to do last June by bringing it to the United Nations.
Thank you for that. James, you and I have known each other for a couple of decades, and I have been reading your writings and your thoughts and concerns on exactly what we're talking about today over that period of time. And just this last week in the Washington Post, you and a co-author wrote that one of the other high-risk actions that can shatter Black lives is having expired tags or temporary plates on their car. Can you go further with that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I very much look forward to seeing this report. I think it's going to be very important because I agree with you that it is a systemic issue. When I was in law school in the early 90s was when the Rodney King trial took place. And I remember being sure that he was going to be convicted. And I remember having my faith in the law. And I was a critic. I understood the history of racism in this country, but my classmates and I, we all saw that video, and we were sure that that those officers who beat him were going to be convicted. And now here we are now waiting for another verdict and another trial. There's another generation of young Black people. My son is 11 years old. We talk about this case every day. And so So there's another generation of people that are looking and asking the question, when somebody has been so clearly and brutally treated by the state, murdered, is there going to be accountability? But Steve, as you said, that really is just the beginning. And so the article that you're referencing that my student TJ Grayson and I wrote together was really trying to make the point that as long as we have police doing so many of these functions that could be done by non-police actors, we are going to have unnecessary violence, and we're going to have unnecessary racism and unfairness. So I think going forward, the big challenge that we face as a nation is, yes, to have accountability in these individual cases like what we're seeing right now in Minneapolis. But we really have to be asking ourselves, do we need and want police to be doing as much as they have been tasked to do? Do we need them responding to people who are suffering from addiction, people who are suffering from mental health crises? Do we need them enforcing the traffic laws the way they've done now? And so that's what that op-ed was really trying to do, is to say, what if we created a non-police force, civilians, unarmed, who are responsible for keeping our roads safe? And that's the kind of thinking, I think, that we're going to need to undertake as a nation going forward.
Thank you for that. I mean, Nana, what is your thinking on that? I mean, I have to just be honest. You know, I've done various shows on this. I have seen friends of mine pulled over because they were racially profiled, you know, driving through a white community, and I happen to be. I've seen this for years and years and years. I interviewed former Republican governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, and said in Camden they had to basically reduce that police department down to its foundations, get rid of officers, and institute very different training. Val Demings, Congresswoman Val Demings, former Orlando police chief, said we need to have a national commission on police training. I haven't seen any of these things happen broadly in the country. And I thought after the George Floyd protests, after the murder, and then the protests and so many other murders that we saw this past year, something was going to change. Has anything really changed this last year?
So I'm really glad, and my answer would be no. First of all, let me deal with that first. My answer would be no, and I guess we were going to law school at the same time, Brother James, but I was here in Los Angeles during the rebellion, during the Rodney King beating, and as well as the rebellion after the acquittal of the 4 cops that beat him. And there was a Christopher Commission. I mean, there was all of this energy that went into making this different, and you know, from now on. And as we see, that hasn't been the case. When we talk about where can we reduce the police force, what can we do? When you look at, I'm really looking forward to you, Brother James, to you, Seth, to all of the folks of Al Jazeera and other activists on the ground, organizers, other attorneys getting into this report, because the commissioners heard 44 cases, families and attorneys, as well as organizers and activists, case by case, including the cases and the family members of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Botham Jean, Kayla Moore, and others. And then heard expert testimony from folks talking about historic violence all the way to Andrea Ritchie talking about police violence against Black women, gender nonconforming, and trans people. And so these conversations are right in the report, this analysis about these pretextual traffic stops, about mental illness. So many of these cases involve traffic stops, involve people with mental illness, involve people that are looking for help and calling the police to get some help, and folks are ending up dead, and in one case, paralyzed, you know, that we looked at. And so there's recommendations here that talk about, of course, the domestic issue and looking at what can be done domestically with respect, you know, all the way from training and reform, all the way to some aspects of abolition, where you're talking about defunding and defanging the police. You find all of that in this report. But there's also the conversations about and findings around the issue of how we take this in the international context. What are the international rules about law enforcement and the use of force? And the commission found again and again that the United States, the police in the United States, don't only not follow the laws in the United States with impunity, but violate international law. And in fact, the commissioners found really importantly, and uniquely in this report, that the systemic police violence against Black people in the United States constitutes a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute, that it is a widespread attack on a civilian population, in this case, Black folks in the United States, accomplished through murder, through torture, and other qualifying means. It's really one of the main highlights of the report, both in analysis and in recommendation.
No, I just want to underscore this point. I found it so fascinating, and thank you for letting me take a look at the report a bit early. But you basically say we are unable to fix this, and we need international intervention. We need the International Criminal Court to take action because the United States has proved itself unable to take the corrective measures broadly that need to be taken. I just want to underscore that I have that right. And what would be, in short form, because I know there are complexities there, for some action like that to actually take place?
Well, the independent prosecutor of the ICC has the capacity under the Rome Statute to do it on their own. They can go and just decide, hey, we're going to look into this. We see that this happens with other countries. For some reason, there's a reticence. I'm saying some reason, we know what they are, but there's a reticence to do that when it comes to the United States, and we're calling on that to happen. We're also calling on the Biden administration to voluntarily subject the United States to the jurisdiction of the ICC for such an inquiry to happen. This is an administration that indicated that Black folks, in his words, brung him to the dance, that it is because of Black folks and the work that we did and in terms of voting, et cetera, that he and the Democrats are in power right now. This is an issue that they know must be addressed, and one of the good faith actions should be to not just sign the treaty and all of those pieces that take time, but to immediately say, yes, the United States is open to the jurisdiction of the court, will put itself under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, and allow there to be this inquiry at that level.
Well, thank you for that. James, I used some powerful language in the opening of today's show, and I talked about our legacy, our horrible legacy in this country of Black lynchings, and how some have viewed this police brutality and these murders that we have seen, not just recently, but over a very long, unending period of time, actually, as lynchings by other means. But there have been some other changes in atmosphere, in tools and tactics in the recent decades, like the global war on terror has ended up with police forces having equipment they would never have had had that not occurred. And you've also, and they're also complicit players in this that you've written about, which I found so interesting and brave to a degree, to say we've had Black leaders in America that are also culpable, that participated in over-incarcerating particularly men in the Black community, creating a culture that destroyed families and that kind of ripped the fabric apart to where we're at. So I'd love to give you an opportunity to talk not just about this enduring problem, but how both those that have been part of it have been there, but how things like the global war on terror backlashed, into some of these issues as well.
Well, I think that's right, and I think when you think about what happened in this country in terms of building mass incarceration and then building this incredibly repressive set of police forces that operate in a lot of cities, right? And those really go hand in hand, that there were a lot of people who played a role in helping develop that. It was really it was bipartisan in many ways, Stephen, as you point out, and my book is about this. It crossed racial lines. I do think that the Black leaders and the Black politicians who were pushing for this, I am somewhat more sympathetic to their position. That is to say, their motivations in many cases. I think it grew out of a real care and concern for their community and desperation. They wanted to do something, and the tools that they had at hand were so limited, so they did turn to the police. But nonetheless, even though I'm sympathetic to their motives, I am critical of a lot of the decisions that were made in the 1980s and the 1990s. The militarization, as you said, which is a result of some of this global war on terror. And now I think the question that we face is how do we respond and how do we chart a different path forward? And I would just want to compliment what Nana was saying about the international. So she went up to the international level, and I want to go down and say the other place I think we have the potential to resist and to fight back is at the very local level, at the very micro level. So when you asked Steve whether anything had changed in the last year, I would say that while police violence hasn't changed and racial profiling hasn't changed, what has changed is this movement of activists and local organizers and young people. My students, I teach in a law school, so I see them every day. They arrive with a fervor and a commitment, and they're doing very smart things. They're going to city councils. They're going to county councils. They're going to mayor's offices. They're looking at the police union contract, and they're asking, why do we have these collective bargaining agreements that allow police officers, when they've shot somebody, to have 7 or 8 or 10 days before they're even interviewed by an investigator? Why are they allowed to look at the body camera footage before they file their police report? Why are we funding in our cities police to do things 10 and 15 and 20 times more money than we're funding school counselors and mental health counselors? So I do think the one source of optimism that I see at the local level is I think that there is a incredible energy over the last 6 months. Over 140 laws have passed in cities and counties across the country in some way to restrict and reduce police violence. And so I think if we can take the international that Nana is pointing to and the very local that I'm pointing us to, those together can be a complementary path forward.
Look, that's heartening, and thank you so much for laying that out. But it's after a couple of decades aging myself in this, but looking at how very people from very different parts of the country, different corners of the nation see things differently. Gravity doesn't work the same everywhere. I want to show a couple of graphs and Nana, get your response to it, because at some point we need to come to some common ground and common understanding. That's why I'm doing this show, so that people see and get an understanding of the tensions that are the horrors that are really out there. But we have this first chart, which shows how many Americans say police treat racial groups equally. And if you talk to the black community, 9% believe that they are treated equally, 42% of whites. That is a big gap in perception. If you look at political party, how many Americans say police treat racial groups equally? Democrats, 10%. Republicans, 64%. So we've got racial divide, and we clearly have party divides in this country in terms of the perception of these issues. Nana, I know that your report had to deal with a cross-section of players, but you had difficulty bridging to Republican participation. I'd just be interested in what you think it's going to take. I mean, is it just going to be a combat to get folks to pay attention? Or do you think there are ways to bring over, some Republicans and more members of the white community to understand the anguish and the injustice that your commission has highlighted?
So the commission's work wasn't necessarily on U.S. party lines.
Right.
It was really looking at exposing this information and giving people the opportunity to see and to hear what is really happening. And I will say this: we had these hearings open to the public so people could join, and just like a regular Zoom has the chat on the side, people asking questions. And it was really clear that it was eye-opening. I have been following these cases. Some of these cases you all have been following. There were things that were talked about from family members and attorneys that made whatever we think was the horror even more clear in its depravity and horribleness. Heard things that I hadn't heard before. And I think that that's part of it. Part of it is for people to really be able to hear to see what's happening, as opposed to living in their bubble. If you're in your bubble and your bubble does not include Black people, your bubble does not include police violence, then of course you're going to have those attitudes, right? And so I think it's really important. If you go to our website, internationalcommission.org, You can actually hear the hearing still right now. The report will be there soon, but I think it's important for people to actually hear from Botham Jean's mother, not snippets from a press release or a press conference, but actually hear her talking for 30 minutes about what the murder of her son was, what it did to her, what it did to her family, what it did to the country of St. Lucia, and how it reflected, upon them. I think it's important for them to hear from Kayla Moore, a Black trans woman who was murdered, to hear from her sister, and to understand being trans and having mental illness and how much the police violence impacts really vulnerable communities. And so that's the work that the commission began, led by NCBL, but along with NLG and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers last July, with our commissioners, again, 12 commissioners from around the world, 4 brilliant rapporteurs, all of us led by the able arms of Attorney Lennox Hines, to really bring this out, to make those connections that James has talked about, from the international all the way to the local and back again, so that we can finally address this issue honestly and with some kind of vigor.
I am finding myself, in this kind of discussion, this kind of work to try to bring people's attention to things. When I was reading James Forman and his students' piece this weekend, about traffic tags, and we had Dante Wright. We also had Lieutenant Caron Nazario, Hispanic, who was stopped. And I have to tell you, it kind of takes you into this place where if we didn't have video, and I have to tell you, I have mixed feelings about video and surveillance and this. I, spent a lot of time in China and see what facial recognition software and kind of a surveillance society looks like. But I'm wondering to some degree whether body cameras, video surveillance, we would not know about Lieutenant Nazario. We would not know about many of these cases if, in fact, if we did not have iPhones and smartphones video recording this. What are your thoughts? Is that the pathway out of this, is basically a move to kind of keep police accountable, and is video going to deliver us, James?
I don't think so. Video can play a role, as you said, and we can all point to these examples that because of video we now know about them. I think that 5 years ago there was a lot of optimism, pretty much across the political spectrum, that, for example, body-worn cameras on police officers would have a significant impact on police use of force. And the research is out, and it doesn't.
Nana, just last, we have about 30 seconds left, and I know this is unfair, but also in your report, you write about the violations of the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, and I like to have discussions wedged in constitutional rights. Can you give us a quick snapshot of what rights are regularly violated of Black Americans?
So we're looking at the right to not be deprived of your liberty, the rights of not being handcuffed, not being detained, the rights of to not be abused, to not be beaten, to not be subjected to excessive force. Those are the right to not be murdered, to not be killed, to not have the police act as judge, jury, and executioner. And I think that it's important, again, that we recognize, as the commissioners did, that these U.S. rights are being violated as well as these international rights. So that it doesn't have to be something that's just an international court, but can start here in the United States as well.
Right. I'll read it. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. I just think that says a great deal. Nana Gyamfi, president of the National Conference of Black Lawyers, and James Forman, Jr., professor of law at Yale University, thanks so much for being with us and sharing your candid thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So what's the bottom line? For a society to function, folks need to trust the police. But for a black or brown man or a woman, remember Sandra Bland, a routine traffic stop could lead to a life or death confrontation. And this is just abhorrent. It's not part of any civilized society or democracy. And it's got to be called out and changed. It's about time that Americans had an open and honest debate on the intersection of racism and policing in this country. Everything should be on the table, including rewriting history, limiting the use of police to enforce traffic laws, less military-style and military-outfitted policing, changing the laws, just whatever it takes to save lives and to create space to hopefully restart building trust across races in our society. Without trust, then America is going to continue to boil and twist itself into knots and never move beyond what many call America's original sin. And that's the bottom line.